Um, Great. So I'm going to just share my screen. And for those who are familiar with our Tuesday webinars, we're going to start with a little knowledge session where we show you how to do a particular function in eState, and then open the floor to questions and see if anybody's got any questions or about using eState just generally. So what we're going to talk about is how to use eState to create residence trusts for homes, cottages, things like that, where the purpose is that the person is going to get the use of that property and to live in it, in essence. So we basically have to have an asset that's a real estate asset in our list of assets, obviously. Makes sense. So as long as we've got real estate that we need to deal with, then we're gonna use that. So here we are in, let's just say we're creating a trust. The client says, I want to create a spousal or a trust for the spouse to stay in the cottage. Okay. So we're going to take the cottage property and we're going to drag it into initial gifts because we're making an initial gift of this cottage. So the first thing that we have to do is we've got to pick the beneficiary. So we're going to go down and pick, let's just say in this case, we're setting up a trust for the spouse to use the cottage. Okay. So we've got the cottage, we've got our choice now between absolute and a trust. We're going to choose trust because we're going to hold this in a trust for the spouse. And the first option you have below is, should this trust provision apply not only to the cottage that we know about right now, but any substituted property as well. So if we just say, listen, any cottage that I own when I pass away, I want this cottage and any substitute property, well, then click on that substituted property button. The first thing we have to think about is who's going to be the trustee for the cottage trust. Usually it's the same as the executors, but perhaps you want to change that. If so, you can just unclick this button and pick the appropriate trustee that you want, trustee or trustees that you want for the cottage trust. I'm going to stick with same as executors. The next thing that we think about is, when is the use of the cottage going to terminate? So that's what this section is about. It's linked. You can think of it as duration of the trust, but we call it termination of use. And so here we're going to add. So there's some options that come up. One is, I want it to be the lifetime of the spouse. Okay, so I'm going to say death, and then it's going to ask me whose death. Well, if it's the wife's death, then we're going to pick the wife as the death that's going to terminate the use, which makes sense. You can imagine if you had multiple people, you could terminate it on one or more people's deaths, but that's fine. So that's one termination event. The next is, let's say the beneficiary says, I don't want to live in this cottage anymore, sell it. Okay. So the termination of use would be the agreement of the beneficiaries. A third common one is where it's the trustee's discretion. So the trustee can sell it anytime they want. Okay. And then whenever you have multiple termination of use options, you have the earlier or later option. Now, in this case, where death is the beneficiary, you're probably going to pick the earliest. Anyway, so that's what we do. Let's skip conditions for a moment here and just go down to the next concept, which is who's going to pay the expenses. So we have a bunch of expenses. We also have the ability, these are sort of their typical ones, but we also have the ability to add other expenses. So if this was a condo and you had, I don't know, common expenses or capital improvements or something like that, you could add that as an expense, common expenses or something. And now that's up here, and you can assign that as well. And so you can pick between the estate paying 100%, the beneficiary paying 100%, or some combination where the beneficiary pays a percentage and the estate pays a percentage of a particular expense. Okay, so that's what we have. Whenever the estate, and you could click if you want all for one or all for the other, you can click on these buttons. It'll just put them all to the beneficiary or all to the estate. Okay. Now, whenever the estate has a payment, so in this case, they're paying all the expenses, we need a source of that. So either the residue or a separate fund. So that's another example. If we want to set up a separate fund, we can either pick the trustee's discretion or put a fixed amount in a fund, set aside $100,000 to cover those costs, or you can leave it to the trustee to pick the amount based on a whole bunch of features factors at the date of death, like the age of the spouse, the repair, of the state of condition of the cottage, a whole bunch of things. So that's why we typically default to trustee's discretion, but you can change it and add it to a fixed. The other thing you could do, as I said, is have it paid from the residue. Now, eState's going to warn you, if we pick the residue as the source of payment, but everything's immediately distributable, then there's not going to be a residue that's going to be hanging around there. So eState would warn you about that kind of thing. Okay. Similarly, if we make the beneficiary responsible for something, one of the other termination of events could be the failure to pay expenses. Okay. Because what happens if they're responsible for paying something, but they don't pay it? What should happen? Should that terminate the use? And eState would warn you about that. If it saw, for example, that the beneficiary is responsible for something, but you didn't make the termination event to include failure to do that, then it's going to at least give you a heads up that you haven't done that. Okay. And I'll show you that in a moment. So then the next thing, we've covered termination of use, we've payment of expenses. The next thing is, do we want to allow the trustee, or with the consent of the beneficiary, without the consent of the beneficiary, to sell this property and buy a replacement property? It's quite common when you're talking about a home, for example. So we could click on that. And then we have an option. Do we want to require that you get the beneficiary's consent before selling it and buying a replacement property? You might want that. You might not want that. That's up to you. And then, or up to the client. And then what happens to the excess proceeds? Because let's say in this case, the cottage is worth $1 million. They sell it, they buy a property worth $500,000. What happens to the excess proceeds? So you can either have that fall into the residue of the estate, or you could deal with it specifically. You could say, I want, in that case, I want the excess proceeds to go however you want. And you would basically create what's akin to a residue distribution for those excess proceeds. You would click, I want to give them to, Bart. Okay. If there's any excess proceeds, it goes to Bart, 100%. But you could create whatever fancy gift of those proceeds you wanted. Okay. And so that's what we can do here. So I'm just showing you that. And then the last thing that we build into a residence trust is the option to purchase. Do we want to give the beneficiary the option to buy the property from the estate at fair market value, or some other market value, a fixed amount, and all of the options to purchase that, issues that you deal with, like how are we going to determine the fair market value if we're going to do it? Are we going to discount it for a partial interest? I'll give you an example of that. Let's say Homer, who's the testator, only owns 50% of this cottage, and the spouse owns the other 50%. When they buy Homer's 50%, if they do they buy it for 50% of the total value, or is there a discount? They pay less because they're only buying a partial interest. That's sometimes the case, rare, but sometimes the case. So we have that option. And then, who's going to determine the value? Who's picking it? How many valuations? Who's paying? Maybe it's the residue that's paying for the cost of the evaluations. Discount for notional commission. Often if there's an option to purchase, in that case, you're not putting it on the MLS. You're not paying a real estate agent. And so you might want to give some benefit to the purchaser for part of the commission or all of the commission. that's being saved. That's what that's about. We also allow the beneficiaries of the estate, if they don't agree with the valuation, we have an option here that says the beneficiaries can obtain their own valuation, and and then it'll get averaged with the estate valuation. We can do that. So there's a bunch of options, and the timing, they got 30 days to get their own appraisal, and who pays for that. And so we've tried to build in as many of these options as we can on the option to purchase. How quickly do they have to determine whether they want to exercise the option? Maybe 60 days. Maybe they close within another 30 days after they say, yes, I want to buy the property from the estate. So those are the kinds of things. And then what happens to the residue? What happens to the proceeds of sale? Does it just go into the residue? Does it go, again, similarly, do you want to give the proceeds somewhere else? So that's sort of how eState deals with residence trusts. So I'm just going to show you how it kind of comes out now. So let me just do it here, and I'm going to show you. I have a couple of examples of trusts here. So here's my preview, and we have I did two trusts. You can see one for the cottage, which we just did, and one for the home. Let's look at the cottage one. So eState sees this as a complicated type of gift. It's a trust for a home, and the client may own 100% of the cottage when they die, but they might not. Maybe they do a transfer into tenancy in common with their spouse, so they only own 50%. We need to deal with that possibility. And so whenever we're talking about the cottage, we're talking about whatever interest they have in the cottage. So it identifies who the beneficiaries are. Remember, we had the cottage disposition date, which is date of death, the date she doesn't want to use it anymore, or the trustee's discretion. They're going to hold it for them to use. The Marge is paying 100% of the capital repairs, but the state is paying the balance. And it's going to come from the residue. And then they can sell the cottage, and the proceeds are dealt with as follows, and it's in a different paragraph. And then here's the option of purchase with all the typical terms that you would need. And again, the cottage falling into the residue at the end of the home at the cottage disposition date. What this also does, so I showed you that you can make the proceeds of sale or the home go somewhere different at the end of the period that you're holding it for. So let's say it's the date when this was another example. I did a home trust, and I said, listen, Marge, you can stay there until you remarry or cohabit, or you die, or you don't want to live there anymore. Well, what this does then is takes the proceeds on that event and puts it into a spousal trust. Okay. So it says, okay, once that happens, then the home, you're going to set aside the home. You might want to amend this to say the proceeds of the home, if it's going to be sold, or however you want to amend it manually. And then it sets up a spousal trust for the spouse. And so that's what happens there. So so that's how you can do residence trusts using eState. And these are more complicated ones. I'm going to just show you a more typical one. Let's just close this down, and then I'll get to some questions. Let's just say we want to do a home trust for kids. Okay, so we're in the spouse, they're both gone. We're in the descendants only scenario, right? We have both spouses gone, kids are alive. We're going to have the home. We're going to drag it in here. We're going to pick my children, because I want all my children to be able to live in the home. I'm just going to pick them as the beneficiaries. I'm going to use a trust. I'm going to say, yes, my home and any substitute property. I'm going to say you can live there until all of you are 25. Okay, let's say. You could do it when the first or all of them have attained. Let's have the estate paying the expenses. Pretty typical kind of thing. And there's your pretty typical home trust for the kids to stay in, basically to a certain age. We would typically also say, listen, if they all agree that they don't want to live there anymore, you can sell it. Maybe we also build in trustees' discretion. This is your typical sort of trust for kids to stay in the principal residence until they're old enough to get on with their own life and move out. And so that's kind of the typical home trust for kids. I'm just going to save that. I'm going to see if there are some questions. How about adding additional terms? Well, spousal trust for principal residence. So, yeah, as long as the proceeds end up in a spousal trust, you should be okay. But obviously, you got to look at the Tax Act and the Income Tax Act and make sure that your principal residence exemption is going to be maintained. I think if you hold it in a trust and then the proceeds also are in a qualifying spousal trust, you should be okay. We don't, just so you know, these special provisions don't appear in the document themselves. They're more just for your record keeping and to remind you of stuff that you want to add. So we will, if we could figure out where to put those special provisions, we would probably do that. We might put them at the end of the trust so they're there at least that you can work on them. But right now they don't actually appear in the document. So that was for Chris. So that's how you can use eState on residence trusts. Any other questions on residence trusts? I use them, I'll just talk about when I use them for the children. I often use them for the children where, you know, it's unlikely that all of the kids are going to want to stay in the home. So what we're trying to do here by using a home trust for the kids is that the trustee is protected. The trustee has discretion to let one or two of the three kids stay in the home and not liquidate it, because the other kid might be already 25 and getting their share of the residue, and they're like, okay, I want my third of the home, and yet the younger kids are staying in the home. So that's the kind of situation. You don't necessarily have to use it every time, but if there's a big gap between ages of children, for example, and you think, and the client says, listen, I want to make sure my youngest doesn't get kicked out of the home and can stay there, even if it's to the disadvantage of the older ones who are out of the house and are, you know, don't have access to that money yet. That's when I would consider doing that. So any other questions about these residence trusts? Thanks, Brody. We're working on them. We're always trying to improve them and make them a little easier to read and those kinds of things. So we continue to do that, but thanks. And listen, the other thing is we need your feedback. If there's stuff that you want to see in our residence trusts or options that you want to provide, you know, obviously whenever we decide about different options, we're balancing between making eState just too overwhelming in some ways, with too many different options, and yet addressing, you know, issues that we need to address with our clients. So please let us know if there's stuff that you think, you know what, here's a thing that you should have on the checklist and be able to draft and those kinds of things. So let us know that. So any other questions that people have about, it doesn't have to be residence trusts, about how do you do something in eState? Feel free to reach out, and right now just maybe unmute and shout it out or put it in the chat, because if you're not sure how to do it, I'm sure there are other people who aren't as well. So and if not, no problem. We'll end a bit early. So all right.
Jordy, if
Yes.
you added, this is James, sorry.
Yeah.
I
Hey,
have my
James.
video on. Nice to see you as always. Just wondering if you added in, something that taints that trust a bit, as because it's for a spouse, a residential trust with them as the beneficiary. What comes up to provide some warnings or issues?
Yeah. So there are warnings that come up. I'm just going to look and see if we've got any. Let's just see here. Okay, so a few things. I'll get to that as well. But there's the issue of, again, there's not enough money. There's no resident to cover the home expenses, right? So it saw that for the cottage and for the home. It will look at, there's another one here, which is, again, we didn't terminate the trust on the fail to pay expenses, so it's warning us about that. There are warnings that talk about the not qualifying as a principal residence exemption. Depending on what you do, it will say, this will not qualify as a principal residence exemption. One of the things we're doing is we're speaking to some tax advisors to make sure that we're, to add some additional warnings about because residence trusts are quite complicated from a tax point of view. So that's something we're working on actually, to make sure that, to the extent, not that we can ever, put every possible warning, but certainly to give alerts if there are, there are tax issues, for example. And I'm just trying to think if this one would trigger that. If I get rid of that. I'm not sure if that will or not trigger any kind of. Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, so I don't, like I said, I don't have an example of that, but it's definitely something where we want to make sure we don't, if we can add it and the logic is there, then we are going to do that for sure.
If you went back in and you took that home as you were working through and you were establishing the terms of the trust, and then you added conditions.
Right. Okay.
Would
First, we gotta
that
make sure that home is a. I don't know, to be honest with you, whether that would trigger that a warning or not. I'd have to go back to the code, because we do have
Okay.
principal residence exemption warnings, but I don't know if that would trigger it, to be honest with you. I'd have
All
to
right,
check.
thank you.
Yeah. But I will check when we get off this call.
Never assume anything, right, Jody?
Yeah. I got to. I'll check the code, but I know we definitely have different principal residence warnings. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Anything else? Feel free to reach out. Nope. Great. Well, thanks everybody. Hope that was helpful. And if there's a topic that you want us to go over, that you find tricky or not sure how to do or whatever, let me know. And like I said, if we can spend the first half of it on it, we can spend 5 minutes on it. We can make sure that we cover it next week. So just reach out if there's something you want to see me do. I'd be happy to. All right. Hope everybody has a great rest of the week. I think Thursday, I hope you guys are going to come by and see Ian and I speak about FLA elections and some new case law on those. So that would be great to have you there. Thanks as always, and have a great rest of the week.